Okay, here's the list of representative heroes for today's lecture. In the history of the world's literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh stands as what we should probably regard as the oldest work that can hold the interest of the general reader, as well as that of the specialist. There was a Sumerian ruler named Gilgamesh who lived at more or less the time from which the story is thought to have come, who may have been the inspiration for it, but probably only in the most general sense. It's essentially a myth, obviously. Sargon I of Akkad is the fellow usually regarded as kind of the Menes of Mesopotamia. He's the fellow who first unified the whole area, but the history of Mesopotamia is going to be much more episodic than the history of Egypt, and Mesopotamia was rarely united for more than a generation or two, until the first millennium BC. Hammurabi of Babylon was another of those who transiently controlled the whole of the Tigris and Euphrates valleys. He's especially famous for his law code, the most interesting such thing to survive from its age. Around the time of the break, we'll begin to hear about the adventures of the ancient Hebrews, who contribute essentially nothing to the history of art, and never amounted to much politically either, but who wrote what is perhaps the most influential literature ever written in the books of the Old Testament. And Moses is traditionally given credit for the first 5 books of this work, and of course for leading his people to the Promised Land. We'll hear then about the establishment of the Hebrew kingdom, and about King Solomon and others, and then about the Assyrian Empire, which gave the Hebrews such a hard time under rulers like Sargon II and Ashurbanipal. Okay, that's the program then, and now for the show. This is a map of ancient Mesopotamia now, and that word is derived from Greek words meaning something like the land between the rivers. And, well, the rivers in question here are the Euphrates and the Tigris. The great American historian James Breasted used the term Fertile Crescent to designate more or less the same area, including also land extending over to the Mediterranean in a sort of vaguely crescent-shaped way. The most arable parts of the Fertile Crescent are what we could call the fertile blobs in green on this map. On a modern political map, Mesopotamia is essentially Iraq. Many of the early cities here have names you can recognize. Babylon, of course, near where modern Baghdad is. The home of Abraham originally, and Erech or Uruk, which is called Warka in the Bible and is possibly the source of the modern name for Iraq. That certainly sounds close to Uruk or Erech. The usual view now is that this area was the home of both the original Neolithic Revolution, the development of farming and settled communities, as well as the home of the first settlements which can properly be called cities. This is a little surprising because Iraq is half swamp and half desert, and not a place I'd pick as a good real estate investment. The Euphrates and Tigris also were not as well behaved as the Nile and flooded much more unpredictably, sometimes leaving cities which were on them high and dry and drowning others. Though I wouldn't want to put this in terms of cause and effect, Mesopotamian history is also, as it were, not the essentially regular flow of events with dynasties lasting for century after century like we find in Egypt. Until the first millennium BC, Mesopotamia was rarely unified for more than a generation or two, and its history is just more irregular than the history of Egypt. It's certainly possible that these facts contributed to what seems to be a generally more pessimistic outlook in Mesopotamian religious life also, compared to the Egyptian view anyway. It's further likely that the dangerous rivers of Mesopotamia account for the importance given to flood stories, like the famous one in the Gilgamesh Epic, about which we'll hear more later. Egypt, understandably, produced no flood stories, at least on the scale of the one in the Gilgamesh Epic and the one in Genesis. This is the way the ancient city of Uruk, which Michael Wood has called the first true city, looks today. There was at least something like a city here, maybe 7,000 to 8,000 years or more ago. Some argue that places like Jericho in Israel or Chaldee in Turkey were cities at an earlier date, but this all depends, of course, on what one calls a city, what sort of criteria are used. The civilization that flourished here and in southern Mesopotamia generally, beginning in the late 4th millennium, is called Sumerian. And these Sumerians are often credited with all sorts of inventions and discoveries, including not only perhaps writing, but the wheel, the domestication of the horse, sophisticated number systems. Among them were people we should probably call the first astronomers, the first doctors. They built mostly with air-dried mud bricks, which do not produce very picturesque ruins, but they did the best they could with what they had. There's little limestone in Mesopotamia. This sandcastle exposed too long to the tides of time, as someone has put it, is the ruin of the White Temple at Uruk, sometimes called the oldest temple in the world dedicated to a god. In this case, the Sumerian supreme being Anu. It's called the White Temple because traces of whitewash have been found on the bricks. It's not exactly as majestic as a pyramid, maybe, but it was built in the late 4th millennium, and so is several hundred years older, though much smaller than even Zoser's stone step pyramid. The Sumerians themselves apparently thought that their forebears came to Mesopotamia by sea, but the fact that they put their temples on top of artificial hills or ziggurats like this suggests, along with other evidence, that they may have come from the mountains, the Zagros to the northeast. This marble image was found in the ruins here and may represent Inanna, who becomes Ishtar, who becomes Aphrodite, who becomes Venus, who becomes Marilyn Monroe, the embodiment of something like what we could call the feminine principle. Although the Narmer palette of about 3100 BC occupies a special place because of its likely historical connection to the unification of Egypt, this is probably older and would get some votes in any attempt to determine what we ought to call the first work of art in the continuous tradition of Euro-Mediterranean creativity. This is somewhat stylized, probably in part at least because it likely is the image of a goddess, but the treatment shows that if the sculptor had been asked to do a real human face, he could have done it. The attention given to the eyes is something which will remain a universal feature throughout the history of Mesopotamian art, despite all the changes in style and politics. Not far from Uruk are the ruins of Ur of the Chaldees, said in Genesis to be the place from which Abraham set out for Canaan. In 1927, Sir Leonard Woolley excavated here and found a deep layer of silt, which the enthusiastic press seized upon as evidence for the flood in Genesis. Unfortunately, I guess we should say unfortunately, this silt layer wasn't present in the ruins of neighboring cities, so biblical literalists were disappointed. But Woolley did find something else that made headlines just as large. He found what the media christened the death pits of Ur. These were simple tombs, the most important of which were the 16 so-called royal tombs, containing the bodies of what we might call first the primary decedent, and many others who seem to have been killed or who committed suicide to accompany this primary decedent into whatever or wherever around 2700 BC. Here on display in the British Museum, you can see some of the things Woolley found in these tombs. Nothing really like them has been found anywhere else in Mesopotamia, which makes it difficult to determine what conclusions we should draw from them. Despite the nice things in them, the tombs themselves would not have been considered fit for a pharaoh's youngest daughter, let alone a pharaoh himself. But they do suggest a more optimistic view of the life to come than is thought usual in ancient Mesopotamia. Here are some of the other things Woolley found. The goat is said to represent Tammuz, the Sumerian masculine equivalent to Inanna. But it hardly seems fair for femininity to be represented by the image of a beautiful woman and masculinity to be represented by a goat. I think there must be some mistake in the translation somewhere. I guess this goat may count as a sort of religious symbol, but on the whole there was little of obvious religious significance found in the tombs. This harp, now much restored, was also found by Woolley. We'll hear a replica of this played in a little while. One of the most interesting things found at Ur is this so-called royal standard of Ur. Exactly what's being represented here isn't completely clear, but it was obviously considered a very important thing since it's made of mother of pearl and lapis lazuli or blue gold. On it you can see what is perhaps the oldest image of a wheel being used in the history of the world, though apparently there is what seems to be a painted wheeled vehicle on a Sumerian pot that is probably some centuries earlier than this. And you can also see here as well probably the oldest depicted use of a domestic horse, or at least something horse-like. It's been claimed that this is a kind of Asiatic donkey rather than a true horse. Also, the wheeled cart looks more like something a farmer would use to haul turnips than the elegant chariot we saw in the earliest surviving picture of a wheeled vehicle in Egypt. But remember, this Sumerian work is well over 1,000 years older than the Egyptian one. As I've said before, it's difficult to believe that the wheel was being used for so long in Mesopotamia before the Egyptians caught on to it. The bottom line is that until we get more evidence, theories about the development and the use of the wheel and wheeled vehicles are going to remain highly speculative. We'll see more of the things Woolley found in a minute, but this is a baked clay cuneiform inscribed tablet. And one of the most important things the Sumerians invented was the cuneiform, i.e. wedge-shaped writing system, which was used to write most Near Eastern languages for something like 3,000 years. The usual way to write using this system was to use a cut reed to imprint symbols onto clay, wet clay. If one were just, say, making a grocery list, the clay tablet could be used and then just wiped over and reused. If one wanted to archive something more important, the clay could be baked, and then it became about as durable a medium as any ever used, the archetypal hard copy. Essentially, everything written on baked clay tablets is still somewhere if we could just find all the pieces of it. The same can't be said of what's been written on paper, of course, a medium that's combustible in the extreme, easily damaged by water, and which is, as one fellow has put it, a favorite food of insects. And what about all our electronic stored stuff? We may be sorry we ever gave up clay tablets. Cuneiform can be inscribed on stone, and in this example you can get a better idea actually of what it looks like. It is, as I said, a writing system which has much in common with an alphabet as opposed to a language. Many different languages can use the same alphabet providing it's flexible enough. The Latin alphabet, for example, has proven to be about the most versatile in the history of the world and is used to write dozens of languages, and cuneiform was sort of the Latin of its day. It was used to write Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Old Persian, and many other languages. Here you see it used to write Old Persian around 600 BC. By this time, cuneiform had been in use over 2,000 years. Egyptian hieroglyphics, on the other hand, as I mentioned a couple of lectures ago, have never been used to write any other language.
The inscription, which is sort of like the Rosetta Stone of cuneiform, is on the so-called Behistun Rock in northwestern Iran. Several scholars, including Georg Grotefend, Emil Botta, Austin Henry Laird, and Henry Rawlinson, all get some credit for translating it, and Rawlinson is sometimes singled out for his death-defying work climbing up to the inscription and copying it. It's written in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian, and how the translation went is much too complicated to go into here, but the process of getting back to Sumerian was certainly aided by what are very like Sumerian Akkadian dictionaries like this one, which survive?
In the late 19th century, Layard was sending back clay tablets from the so-called Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh to the British Museum, where George Smith, an essentially self-taught translator, was sorting them when, in among the generally dull records and accounts, he suddenly came across the resonant phrase, "and the flood swept there over." Eventually, after going to Nineveh himself to help in the search, he was able to piece together and decipher the earliest essentially complete story of the flood with a capital F. Only he wasn't reading Genesis, he was reading the famous Epic of Gilgamesh. The story, which apparently was current, as other finds have confirmed, as far back as the 3rd millennium BC, long before any serious scholar believes Genesis was written down anyway. That some parts of the Gilgamesh version are almost word for word the same as the Genesis version seems to imply that it was the source for the story of Noah, or that they had some other common source. While we see some of the other things Woolley found in the 3rd millennium tombs at Ur, I'll tell you a bit about the Gilgamesh story. This is a 7th century BC statue from Khorsabad thought to represent Gilgamesh, the hero of the epic. There was in fact a king of Uruk called Gilgamesh in the 3rd millennium who probably owned some stuff like Woolley found and who may have been the source of the character's name. But obviously many of the hero's adventures are mythical in nature and were not part of the biography of any mortal man. This dagger found by Woolley in the death pits of Ur is 1,400 years older than the one we saw that belonged to King Tut, and I'm not sure that Tut's is any finer than this. Gilgamesh himself may well have carried one like it. The Gilgamesh Epic begins with the story of a fellow named Enkidu, who is a sort of Rousseau-esque noble savage living contentedly in the wilderness until he is seduced by a woman from the big city who persuades him to move to her home away from his natural wild environment. City ways aren't congenial to him, however, and he gets drunk and disorderly, and the king of the city, Gilgamesh, has to deal with him. They have a titanic fight, knock whole buildings down, and snort like bulls. In this, however, they undergo a kind of male bonding experience and decide to go off and have adventures together. This helmet was also found by Woolley at Ur. They kill a giant named Humbaba and prance all around boastfully, which makes the gods angry. They're guilty of what the Greeks call hubris, excessive pride, and a disregard for the part the gods obviously played in the conquest. The gods decide to teach them a lesson and kill one of them, and it is Enkidu who is chosen. The death of his friend does bring something home to Gilgamesh. Not so much the error of his braggy ways, however, as a vivid revelation of the fact of human mortality. Søren Kierkegaard, the great Danish philosopher of the last century, says that all men are mortal means something different when your brother dies. It's one thing to acknowledge an abstract truth. Ah, yes, we must all pay taxes. Ah, yes, we must all die someday. And another thing to deal with an IRS audit or to deal with the actual death of someone close to us. This gold beaker vase was also found at Ur. Gilgamesh then decides to go and talk to a fellow named Utnapishtim, who is said to know the secret of eternal life. This Utnapishtim is the Mesopotamian Noah, and before he will tell the secret of immortality to Gilgamesh, he wants him to hear the story of his great adventure in the flood. And this is the story which, as I've said, is very similar to the one in Genesis. The Gilgamesh Epic is available in almost any bookstore, so you can check this out for yourselves. After he tells the story, he then tells Gilgamesh that if he can stay awake for 2 weeks, he'll become immortal. I wouldn't advise you to try this at home. I know a lot of you have trouble staying awake for the length of this lecture, let alone 2 weeks. If it's any consolation, Gilgamesh couldn't do it either. So Utnapishtim gave him an alternative. He told him that there was a certain herb that grew in a certain lake, and if he ate that, it would make him immortal. Gilgamesh found the herb, but before he could eat it, a fish snatched it away, so Gilgamesh had to go back to Uruk as mortal as ever and deal with death like everyone else. Around 2400 BC, the Sumerians came under the control of Sargon of Akkad, of whom this is thought to be a portrait, and who was the first man to essentially unify all of Mesopotamia, although his achievement was not destined to last long. The evidence supporting the claim that this is Sargon is flimsy, but as Churchill said of the statue of Richard the Lionheart in front of Parliament, this is at least what he ought to have looked like. And this bust is at least contemporary with Sargon, and he was the most important guy around. The history of Mesopotamia, as I've said, is much more complicated than the history of Egypt, and until the advent of the Assyrians, many centuries beyond where we are now, no would-be dynasty was able to keep the whole area under anything like central control for more than a couple of generations or so. Among the features of the Sumerian civilization which appealed to the Akkadians, Sargon's people, was the Cuneiform Alphabet, which they adapted to their own Semitic language, a language more related to Hebrew and Arabic than to Sumerian, which is not Semitic and in fact not closely related to any other language. This presumed portrait of Sargon is the earliest surviving portrait in bronze in the history of the world's art, and one of the earliest surviving portraits of any sort that displays real artistic greatness in this medium. Bronze is, of course, recyclable, and few large bronze works have survived from this early in antiquity unless they were hidden from barbarians who preferred usually swords or plowshares to art. This is obviously a very accomplished work and implies a considerable series of lost earlier works that would have led up to it. It's obviously not the artist's first work, let alone a first work in a new medium. Sargon's military success has been in part attributed to long-range archery, but he was also thought a favorite of the gods, which would help, and is in fact said to have been born of a virgin and abandoned in a basket. Sargon's son lost his conquests and is said to have been whacked to death by his angry secretaries with their baked clay tablets. However, his grandson, Naram-Sin, whom you see on a stele now in the Louvre, transiently reunited Mesopotamia again. Quite a dramatic thing it is. Like Pharaoh, he appears larger than life in his struggle against the enemy, but he was not looked upon as a de facto god the way pharaohs were. I mentioned that H.W. Jansen thinks that the Egyptian Narmer palette is the first work of art to commemorate an historical event, but he thinks also that this is the earliest surviving actual monument to a conqueror. It's about 6 feet high. It probably, in fact, commemorates the conquest of Ebla, now in Syria. After his death, the unity of Mesopotamia collapsed once again into small and smaller states, not to be reestablished till Hammurabi's day some 300 years later. The fact that Mesopotamia was not politically united during that period doesn't, however, mean that nothing worthwhile went on. Around 2100 BC, a fellow named Ernamu established what is sometimes called the Third Dynasty of which is associated with what some call the Sumerian Renaissance. It was in his day that the most well-preserved of all the ancient ziggurats was erected, the 100-foot-high example in which you can see in the computer-generated image here of what ancient might have been like at about this time. looks today after extensive restoration by the Iraqi government, which once was optimistic about attracting tourists to the area. Ziggurats bear a vague resemblance to pyramids, but they were very different in function. No one was ever buried in or under a ziggurat. They are kind of like artificial hills which serve as platforms for the actual temples which are on top of them. Like medieval cathedrals, they were essentially urban also, not out in the country where one finds pyramids. Here's another view of it. Ernamu is considered one of the more civilized rulers of the whole ancient Mesopotamian world and issued a law code which predates the more famous one of Hammurabi by centuries. It's not as extensive, as far-reaching, but H.W.F. Saggs says it is less barbaric because there's less physical corporal punishment. Fines are more common. The trouble with that, of course, is that unless the fines are based on wealth, the rich wind up escaping any real punishment altogether. What does Bill Gates care about parking tickets? Putting a criminal's eye out may seem cruel or unjust, but it at least is equally cruel to rich and poor alike. Just or not, Ernamu wound up, as it is said, smashed like a pot on some unknown battlefield. This fellow, Gudea, the ruler of Lagash, was another civilized fellow of Ernamu's day, around 2000 BC. He survives in several distinctive portraits like this, which remind me a bit of the portrait of Pharaoh Khafre we saw in the Egyptian Museum. These are also diorite, these portraits of Gudea, for one thing, and there's something of the same sort of Buddha-like presence about them. Like Khafre, he looks both serene and powerful, and his clean-shaven face also, I think, makes him resemble the Egyptians a bit. Here he is again. There are about 15 or 20 surviving portraits of him, some showing him with something like a blueprint on his lap. There's only one record of a military campaign involving him, which is a little puzzling since he lived in a bad neighborhood. This is a statue of Interschomagon of Mari on the upper Euphrates. It is sometimes suggested that Mesopotamian art has much the same episodic quality that we find in Mesopotamian political history. This makes some sense to me, although there are certainly some not easy to define characteristics that do seem to me to set it as a whole apart from, say, Egyptian art. This fellow from Mari at the north end of Mesopotamia in Syria, for example, looks at first very different from Gudea, with whom he was more or less contemporary, but the pose is nevertheless very similar. This fellow is from Eshnunna near Babylon. Figures like this are called eye gods, sometimes for obvious reasons. As I mentioned earlier, the treatment of the eyes is one thing that is a common thread throughout the history of Mesopotamian art. These figures are thought to have been surrogate worshippers, figures, these eye gods, figures left in temple precincts to take the place, in effect, of churchgoers who might not have been able to make it in person on occasion. The idea seems to have been that you could leave a stand-in like this and then play golf on Sunday with a clear conscience. In about 1792 BC, Hammurabi became the ruler of the heretofore second-class city-state of Babylon, and soon raised it to the level of a major power, and ultimately reunited essentially all of Mesopotamia under himself. He announced that Anu and the Sumero-Akkadian divinities had abdicated in favor of his Babylonian god Marduk, which gave a sort of religious sanction to his expansion. And it is probably Marduk, or possibly Shamash, another important divinity sometimes called the sun god, before whom he appears on top of the famous Hammurabi stele now in the Louvre. He is here being shown the rod of straightness and the circle of completion, which are thought together to represent something like justice. It is his so-called law code for which Hammurabi is best remembered. It is, in fact, a list of some 282 laws, and while not the earliest surviving such list, it is much more complete and informative than those like that of Ernamu, for example, which precede it. Here you can see the whole stele now. In his memorable introduction to the code, Hammurabi emphasizes that his goal is to cause justice to prevail, to destroy evil and protect the weak. Which sounds good, but the basic principle of the code is the Lex Talionis, or law of retaliation. It is in the law code of Hammurabi that we first read an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, long before these were part of Hebrew written law in Leviticus. Also, the death penalty is invoked for a large number of crimes, from murder to selling bad beer, and this offends modern sensibility, which views capital punishment as roughly the moral equivalent of cannibalism. Here you can see a detail from the stele of Hammurabi. Today we're led to think that the simple desire for revenge is bad, and that the purpose of punishment among civilized people should really be to reform the criminal, not just hurt him. It's worth pointing out, however, that most of the civilizations in history we consider great have taken not only the death penalty, but the slow death penalty for granted. I'm reminded again of what Kierkegaard says about the distinction between an abstract principle and its application to the individual. It's easy enough to say, yes, let's reform criminals, just taking our revenge out on them is not socially productive. But if your child is accidentally killed in a drive-by shooting, you might suddenly see things a little differently. This is the core of a ziggurat built by the Kassites near modern Baghdad. Hammurabi and his laws were no more successful at establishing a long-lived dynasty than any of his predecessors, however. Soon after his death, Mesopotamia was overrun by the Indo-European Hittites from Asia Minor, and then by the Kassites from Persia. The Hittites, although I'm not going to say much about them here, are quite an interesting bunch and have left extensive remains. Their military success has been attributed in part to their development of iron weapons. The Kassites have left little besides this ziggurat fragment, though they seem to have also spoken an Indo-European language. For the next several hundred years, however, essentially until the rise of the Assyrian Empire around 1000 BC, Mesopotamia is going to be in a sort of dark age, and Georges Roux says that most of the records of the period can be read in about the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. Centuries are reduced to sentences. It was near the end of this period that the Hebrews moved into the western edges of the Fertile Crescent. So after the break, we'll hear about them.